It says, how do you find the exact value of cosine 3 pi over 4? Okay, so if you're in pre-calculus right now, or advanced functions, or you're in grade 12, so we've learned back then that if you have, let's say, cosine, right, typically it would be in the form of an angle, right? So now we're dealing with radians, right? Because we know that radians is also a unit of measurement for angles, right? So because this is 3 pi over 4, right, let's start off by writing or drawing our quadrants. Okay, so first of all, when we have cosine 3 pi over 4, how do we know what 3 pi over 4 is, right? So here's the thing. Because you're still unfamiliar, right, which is totally fine, right, because we're used to seeing degrees in terms of the measurement of the angle, right? Even me, I'm used to seeing degrees, right? When I learned radians, I was like, okay, what is this, right? So remember how pi is actually 180 degrees, right? So that's what we're going to do today. So we're taking 3 times 180 divided by 4. Because some students, it's still I guess boggles them in terms of just looking at the angle and they're not really sure where 3 pi over 4 is if they're reading this in radians. So what I tell my students, right, you know that pi is equal to 180 degrees, right? So all you have to do is convert this into degrees and then kind of map that into your head and actually visualize that. Okay, so I know that 3 times 180 divided by 4, that's equal to 135 degrees, right? So I know that 3 pi over 4 is in fact 135 degrees. So now I know that this is 135 degrees. I actually know where that is in my quadrant. So this is actually found in quadrant 2, right? So that's what 3 pi over 4, or that's how 3 pi over 4 looks like, because you're starting from this, right? This is 0 degrees. Basically, you're opening up. Does that make sense? So this is 3 pi over 4, which is 135 degrees. Okay, so now that you know that, right? If you remember, we actually have related acute angles, right? So what are related acute angles? It's basically your other angle, right? Because you know that this opens up starting from here to here, right? First of all, this is quadrant 1 and this is quadrant 2. So there should be another angle, right? Because remember, you have your x-axis here. So in your x-axis, you do have a straight angle. So in that case, this would be another angle, right? Starting from this quadrant, right? So if you're going clockwise this time, right? So you're starting from this 0 degrees, but now this is going to be a negative value, right? Because you're going against where you typically have that positive angle. Does that make sense? So you're going the opposite way, right? As opposed to going counterclockwise. So now this would be a negative value. And if you recall, right, so all you have to do is, have pi, right, minus 3 pi over 4. So let's do that. And make sure your calculator is actually in radians, because if it's in degrees, you're pretty much um, done for. Because I know I've had students in the past who come to me and they're like, oh, so my calculators is in degrees, right? I'm taking a test where everything is in radians and they had a calculator which is in degrees. So you can't really find the exact same value. So make sure, check your calculator first. So yeah, so as I mentioned, you know that this is a straight angle, this is pi, right? So all you do is you take pi minus 3 pi over 4. So you're going to get pi over 4, right? So you know that this is pi over 4. So this pi over 4, I know for a fact that this is 2 pi minus 3 pi over 4. So I know that the related acute angle would be pi over 4, right? And in fact, that's going to be negative, right? So this is my related acute angle. And as you all know, I like to do 180 divided by 4, right? So this is 45 degrees, right? So I know that this is 45 degrees. And because we have special triangles, right? So what are special triangles? If you remember your 45, 45, 90 triangles, right? So we know that this is 45 degrees, so this must be pi over 4 as well, which is 45 degrees. And then you have your right angle over here. So now, right, because if you go back to the question, okay, let's go back to the question. So on the question, it says you need to find the exact value of cosine 3 pi over 4, right? So we're going to use the special angle, and see what the exact value of cosine 3 pi over 4 is, right? So now, because we know that the related acute angle is pi over 4, we have that negative sign and we have cosine pi over 4, right? Let me try to move this down so you guys can see that. Okay, great. Can you guys see that? So I'm saying that cosine 3 pi over 4 is the exact same value as the negative of cosine pi over 4 because pi over 4 is your related acute angle, right? And because you're starting from this opposite side of your x-axis, right? That means this is going to be a negative value. Okay, so now that we have that, right? And if you recall our special angle 45, 45, 90, this is basically 1, right? And then your right angle opposite of that, which is your hypotenuse, this is square root of 2. And then on the other hand, because this is pi over 4 and this is also pi over 4, which is both 45 degrees, therefore you can say that this is going to be 1 and this is also equal to 1. Okay, great. So we know what the values are. So in this case, we know that this is cosine pi over 4, right? So what is cosine again? If you remember SOHCAHTOA, it's adjacent over hypotenuse, right? I should write that down. Okay, SOHCAHTOA. So this is how I remember if I'm talking about cosine, I know to look for the adjacent side and the hypotenuse. So adjacent of pi over 4 would be this, right? So that means it's going to be negative, right? Because of that negative sign over there, and you have 1 and hypotenuse. So adjacent over hypotenuse. So hypotenuse would be square root of 2. So that's why you have a square root of 2 here. And because we want to rationalize, we can't have radicals in our denominator, therefore we need to multiply this to square root of 2, right? Because remember in math you cannot have a radical in your denominator. Okay, great. So once we have that, right, we're going to get negative 1 times square root of 2, that would be negative square root of 2, and as a result, your denominator, that gets rid of your exponents, right? Square root of 2 times square root of 2 is going to be simply 2, right? So that's how we know that this is cosine 3 pi over 4 is actually equal to negative square root of 2. And when you try to plug this into your calculator, right, like right now, cosine 3 pi over 4, when you punch that in, this is equivalent to this. Does that make sense? So in order for you to find the exact value of whatever angle you're looking for, you need to look at your related angles if you don't have a calculator in front of you. Okay, great. But again, depending on your teacher, right? If you're taking advanced functions or pre-calculus, typically you would have a calculator but at that point. So this is not even necessary. But this is just a way to visualize if you're doing this manually. Okay, hopefully that was clear. I didn't want to overcomplicate things because you do have your calculator, but that's how you're going to solve this question. Okay, let's see what they said. By the way, just so you know, I'm currently at oneclass.com/homework-help, and these are all questions in the math section. Okay. Yeah, so as you can see, they've said that cosine 3 pi over 4, can you guys see this? And you have negative cosine pi over 4, which is exactly what we said. And they're looking at the 45, 45, 90-degree triangle. And you have the sides of 1, 1, and square root of 2. Personally, I think that the question, what they've said, it's right. But I think because it's trig, I would really appreciate if we do have a right angle to actually visualize that, and also the angles, like 3 pi over 4. I know they specifically mentioned that it's in the second quadrant, but I think I would really appreciate, even as a student, for example, if I'm learning this, right, I want to see quadrant 1, quadrant 2, 3, and 4, and this 3 pi over 4 plotted. Does that make sense? So yeah, to make this better, I would say this is right, but I'm looking for something that's very visual, which I've talked about, hopefully, and you understand it.